Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Debunked Files. We're excited to have our very special guest, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, on again in a part 2. And if you missed part 1, make sure you go back and watch that. It's, of course, on our YouTube channel. And let us know. Give us feedback while you're watching today. We did have a couple questions, and one in particular was from Carl, who couldn't be on with us. But he said, so I'm going to get this right because he texted me. He said, why should Christians really care about this whole issue? Should we just leave it to the smart guys and let them beat each other up with their IQs, and us Christians, we should just stick to reading the Bible and praying? So maybe Dr. Meyer can address that. But before that happens, I'm going to introduce, of course, my co-host, Mr. Bub Coons.
Greetings. Yeah, I love that. Off camera, Carl's watching, and he's at some camp that he doesn't have any kind of internet, so he couldn't be on the show, which would have been great because he loves this topic and speaks on it a lot. But so he did squeeze in a question there, Stephen. What do you think about that question? Shouldn't we just leave this stuff alone? And how important is it really to think through these things?
Well, it's the question of biological and cosmological origins is a fundamental worldview question. Every worldview has to answer the question, what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else came? If we're theists, we believe that the fundamental entity from which everything else came is a personal God, and we also believe that the physical universe and life emerged as a result of the creative acts of such a being. That's part of the biblical witness, and so the standard evolutionary theory denies that there is the activity of a designing agent involved in the creation of life, and it also affirms that, or scientific materialists have affirmed that the universe is eternal and self-existent. So those are two really diametrically opposed views. Is it a mind over matter view, or is it a matter produces our minds and then when we die we rot, and that's the whole story? What is the fundamental the fundamental causal explanation of the universe? Is it that there's a mind and a purpose and intelligence behind things, or are we the product of undirected, unguided processes? Those are two competing worldviews in the culture, and our view of biological and cosmological origins, our scientific view of those topics, ends up having implications for which of those two larger worldviews or philosophies is most likely to be true. If you think that unguided, undirected processes produced everything, then it's a short step from there to thinking that all that is at work in the world is unguided, undirected, materialistic processes, and you will likely affirm, or materialism in that point becomes a better candidate worldview, let's say. And on the other hand, if you think there's evidence of actual design at work in the origin of the universe and life, then you see there's evidence of that, then you have good reason to be a theist. So the issue of origins, biological origins, cosmological origins, is in a way a surrogate for a larger worldview discussion. Some people will try to combine theism with evolutionary theory. We can talk about that separately. But I think basically the question of where things came from is fundamental to deciding what we think is the fundamental process or entity at work in the universe. It gets right to that prime reality question.
Yep, that's a great response. Okay, we're shifting gears here, and Les Candace, do you have something else? Do you have something else? Throwing out new stuff.
I got nothing else. That's all I got right now. But I know we wanted to replay the mic'd up video that we ended with the last episode, just to kind of refresh it in your minds. And again, make sure if you are watching, you're commenting, you're chatting. Let us know if you have questions, and we'll try to get to some of those. But let's go ahead and play that mic'd up video just to give everybody a refresh. Sound good, Bub?
Yep.
So today we're asking people about evolution.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on evolution?
I believe that it's real. I believe that Darwinism is how we came to be here today. So that is what I have to say about it.
So how did you come to that conclusion? Like, what made you believe in Darwinism, evolution?
Scientific research, mostly, papers that I've read online, and really it's the only thing that makes sense. I understand the religious theories and everything, and I'm a religious person myself. I'm a Catholic, but that doesn't mean that science is not real, to be honest. So.
So what specifically, really sold it for you about evolution?
I don't know if it was any one thing. It was just mostly the amount of evidence that was towards evolution rather than against it. There's not a lot disproving evolution.
Could you give me an example of some of that evidence?
The DNA we share in common with monkeys, and all the way back. It can take you. Obviously, I'm not well versed in the subject, but I can tell you that I know more about it. More about how to prove it than to disprove it, I can tell you that.
Okay. Well, prove it to me.
I said I know more about it, that doesn't mean I can.
Well, I thought you were saying you know more about proving it than disproving it.
I do, because I can't disprove it at all.
Gotcha.
I can say that I believe in evolution, but that doesn't mean that I can prove it to you. So.
What makes you think it's real?
Just because, that little picture of the monkeys,
Yeah.
the climbing up into a human thing, that picture. I don't know. I've never really done a deep dive on it.
So what do you think about evolution being a Christian?
I believe that some things evolve.
Like what?
Everything kind of evolves, but I don't think that, we came from monkeys or nothing like that.
So where do you think we came from?
I think we came from test tubes.
Test
Probably
tubes?
that guy's science lab. No, I was just playing. I think that, I believe the Christian story, to sum it up, to kind of make it short. I came from my mama came from her mama, and nobody ever came from monkeys. That's what I believe.
What is the Christian story?
That, that we all come from Jesus, a God, one almighty, all being, all powerful.
Were you taught evolution in school?
Sure, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on it?
Stand by God. I personally believe the view of Christ and all that, so I believe that God made us what we are.
Do you guys have any opinions on evolution?
Yeah, I believe in evolution, yeah.
Yeah, I believe it's real. I don't have any super strong opinions other than that.
Yeah.
So what are your reasonings for believing? What led you to believe in it?
All of science pointing towards that being true.
You think all of science points to it being true?
Yeah.
All of mainstream accepted science, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah. So could you give me an example?
Give me an example?
Yeah,
of
of some of the science that proves it.
Yeah, sure. We have the archaeological evidence of the specific animals that we ourselves are descended from. There's Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Neanderthalis, which we're not descended from, but that we are related to. They look really similar to us, and we can find specific timelines where their fossils become more similar to our fossils, and then anatomically modern humans start appearing. So to me, that's a very strong evidence, at least pointing towards our evolution.
Yeah. How about you?
Just what they said. Just what they said. They put it best. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay. So have you actually looked at the actual fossils of those?
Have I seen the fossils in
Well,
person?
what they actually found.
Yeah, I've seen some of them.
Yeah.
I've seen fossils of Homo neanderthalis. I've seen fossils of Homo habilis. I've seen
Yeah.
fossils of ancient anatomically modern humans, yeah.
Gotcha. How complete were they?
Some complete skeletons, especially for anatomically modern humans. Mostly skulls. For a lot of the older ones, Homo erectus we have a lot of complete skeletons of, which is really great. Homo habilis, I don't know about that. The Homo neanderthalis skeleton that I found was femurs and mostly the skull. The skull was pretty sick.
Gotcha. So are you a strong believer in evolution?
Yeah.
So you think it's a fact?
I think it's a theory.
A theory. So do you think it's possible that something else could be true?
I think it's extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe in intelligent design, so I'm religious. I think that there is a God that created us, and evolution is just the tool that it uses to create and guide everything. Yeah.
Gotcha. So do you consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah,
Gotcha. So how long have you been a Christian?
my whole life.
Awesome. So you grew up in the church?
Yeah, I grew up Catholic.
Gotcha. Are you a Christian or religious at all?
I'm spiritual, but not really. I wouldn't really label myself as Christian.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So Do you think like the Christian view and evolution conflict, or do you think that they actually go together?
It depends on who you ask. I believe, like I said, in intelligent design, I think they go together. I think they're only mutually exclusive if you decide they are. I think the stories in Genesis of the creation of the world, you can interpret them literally if you choose to, but the idea of a creation myth and its value as a rhetorical device and thematic devices, other than just a literal story of the creation of the world, is perfectly valid. And that's how I choose to interpret Genesis.
There you go. Dr. Meyer, I'd love to talk to you about these two things, theistic evolution and the fossil record, because it's, hey, archaeological evidence, science proves that. All it took was the monkey to man chart. God uses evolution to do his work. What are your thoughts on some of this? Let's talk. Start wherever you'd like to, and let's go for it.
That last young man was quite well spoken and had obviously given some of this some serious thought. I thought it was interesting the way some of the first speakers simply affirmed their belief in evolution without, of course, defining what was meant by that, because as we talked about in a previous essay, evolution can have multiple different meanings, but based on the claim that science was real. So they kind of equated science with evolution, and there was almost no additional evidence beyond that. So it's what mainstream science has established. So there's a kind of an appeal to authority. The one thing, the first young man said that he talked about that our DNA was so 98% similar to monkey DNA, and that showed that we had the common ancestry. It's an interesting fact that a lot of people don't know is that number is coming down. It's 98% or 99% of the alignable DNA. There's a lot of DNA that's not alignable, and when you take that into account, those numbers drop fairly precipitously. There are varying estimates among people who are now studying this in the field of bioinformatics and genomics, ranging from still 96, 95% to as low as 85%. But what's even more striking, and we have a research project that we're supporting on this, is that the DNA, as your little video showed in the previous episode, DNA directs the construction of proteins. And when you look at the proteins and compare those between chimps and humans, those proteins are only about 40% similar. And so what that shows is that that DNA is kind of like a library, and there's a higher information processing system or algorithm at work in the cell or in organisms, and which decides which parts of the DNA are going to be read and how they're going to be concatenated with other sections of gene products. And so when you compare the output of the DNA, it's dramatically different between chimps and humans. And that suggests that whereas we might have a fairly similar library of genetic options, the information processing system that decides how the genetic text gets put together is dramatically different between chimps and humans. And that makes sense because we know that anatomically and behaviorally and cognitively, there are many qualitative differences between chimps and humans. So that 98% stat was always, it was a go-to kind of proof text for proponents of universal common ancestry and the idea that chimps and humans share such an ancestry. But upon closer examination, we're now seeing evidence of tremendous disparity, still at the very low level in biology, at the level of proteins. But that disparity at the level of proteins is showing that the stat about the genetic information is deceptive, because what's really important is how the genetic information gets processed and expressed. And we now know that the way it gets expressed is quite different between our two species. So if high degrees of similarity point to common ancestry, what do significant disparities point to? By the same logic, they would point to separate ancestry. So I think this is not nearly the open and shut case, and that many people have thought by just reading that one stat out of context.
Why is that convincing either way? Let's say there are similarities, and couldn't that just prove a common designer? I mean,
It absolutely could prove.
what are they
It's an
trying to say with that?
Yeah, it's an equivocal piece of evidence. It could be that and many computer scientists have pointed this out, that in computer science you have a lot of source code that's used commonly for different applications, and it's reusable. So good designers use the blocks of the same text, but then they have additional text that will affect how that text is used, or which parts of it are expressed, and so the difference that makes a difference is often fairly small at the level of digital code. And the same thing could very well be true in life. In fact, I think it is. The digital code is quite common, or there's a lot of digital code. The genetic text there's a lot of common genetic text between chimps and humans, but the way it's utilized in order to make higher order structures, first proteins, then distinctive cell types, then distinctive types of tissues and organs, and then the overall arrangement of those tissues and organs to make a wholly different animal. The information involved in arranging those higher level systems is quite different, and we now have strong evidence of that.
I'd love to get into the fossil record with you, because this guy, the last guy, listed a lot of the things that he saw in quote unquote archaeology, as opposed to perhaps geology.
He meant paleontology, but he was otherwise very well spoken. And
no, either way, yeah, you're on the spot, and all kinds of different things happen. So, I think you're okay if it's like just right.
Okay,
unless it's bothering
I'm doing
you.
fine. Got strange light across my shirt here.
As long as it's not on your face.
Let's put the question of the history of life into broader perspective. We can get so focused on alleged hominid fossils and so forth that we miss the forest through the trees. I mean, we're obviously interested in where we ourselves came from, but there's a history of life that precedes us by quite a long time. And the overarching pattern of the fossil record is not the great branching tree that we talked about last time as one of the meanings of evolution. Again, evolution can mean change over time. It can mean continuous change over time, such that the best way of depicting the history of life is a great branching tree where all the branches connect back to a single common ancestor. And then there's the idea of an unguided, undirected process causing all that change. And typically, Darwinists and neo-Darwinists will affirm that mutation and natural selection is the main evolutionary mechanism driving the change. The gentleman in the video was talking about, and the young woman too, who talked about the pictures of the monkeys becoming the Australopithecines, becoming the Homo habilis, becoming the Homo erectus, becoming us. We've all seen that. It's kind of sometimes called an icon of evolution. It happens that there's a huge gap in the fossil record between the genus Homo and the genus Australo. And that the young man near the end kept mentioning Homo habilis. Many paleontologists, evolutionary anthropologists, now I'm trying to keep the light off my face, sorry, regard Homo habilis as an artifact of classification, that is to say, not a real animal. And so there is a very significant gap between these two, the two genera of Australo, like the Australopithecines, and then the Homo erectus and anatomically modern man, the Homo genus. So, and that turns out to be a common feature of the fossil record across many different body plans and especially the higher taxonomic levels. If you remember from biology, we have species and genus and family. Those are the lower taxonomic levels. They denote smaller differences in form, but then we have the higher taxonomic categories of order, class, and phylum or phyla, and those bigger distinctions, often representing wholly different body plans or arrangements of body parts and tissues, we find are very, when they appear, when a new phylum or class appears in the fossil record, they almost always do so very abruptly. Same with all the orders of mammals. There are 17 orders of mammals that arise in about 55 million years ago, plus or minus, and each of them arises very abruptly with no discernible ancestors in the lower in the lower sedimentary strata. Same thing for the very first animals in the Cambrian period. And so the overarching pattern in the fossil record is one of abrupt appearance followed by what's called stasis, where there's no directional change in the morphology of the organism until the organism goes, or type of organism goes extinct. So we don't really see the picture of the branching tree. We see something that looks more like an orchard of separate trees, perhaps. And so we've all heard this story that the fossils support the Darwinian picture of the history of life. They really don't. And in addition, there's great discontinuity now evidenced in the genomic record. We have something called orphan genes, which are genes that bear no sequence similarity to any other known genes. And across pretty much all the different taxonomic categories, we have organisms that have very significant portions of their DNA as orphan genes that bear no similarity to any other genes. And so that that evidence of discontinuity also suggests that the continuous tree of life picture may not be the right picture of the history of life. It's not the main thing that proponents of intelligent design are challenging, but it's worth pointing out because that was the main type of evidence that many of your young men and women on the street were alluding to.
Right. It sounded like that's what they had been taught. They bought into it, maybe didn't look any deeper than what somebody said. They showed them the chart. They said this what happened, this what happened. But so you're saying that there's minor...
Going all the way back to, sorry to interrupt, but going all the way back to 1980, Stephen Jay Gould, the famous evolutionary paleontologist from Harvard, said that that neo-Darwinism is dead except as textbook orthodoxy. And of course, he was famous for formulating a new theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium that tried to take into account the overwhelming disparity that we see in the fossil record between major groups of organisms. You see the abrupt, again and again, the abrupt appearance of the first animals, the first winged insects, the first turtles, the first birds, the first flowering plants, the first mammals. I wrote an article with the German paleontologist Gunther Beckley, and we identified, I think it was 19 major instances of abrupt appearance of biological novelty, of new anatomical form, what's sometimes called morphological innovation, new ways of doing life emerging abruptly. So
you're saying in one way that are you talking like it's a completely different blueprint and it just shows up out of nowhere? Is that one way to say it?
Exactly.
Okay. And how do you get to the new blueprint?
We call this the trade secret of paleontology, but we've actually known about it for a long time. It's not percolating into the textbooks.
Okay. So that's remnants hauntingly. What is that one quote familiar with? It sounds like a creation when things just pop into existence from out of nowhere. But some of these.
There's a Chinese paleontologist who, upon being confronted with the abrupt appearance actually, there's a Chinese fossil find that was written up in Time magazine in 1995. It's a major Cambrian era find where it again documents the abrupt appearance of a whole wide range of new forms of animal life. And one of the paleontologists said, "How fast do these new forms of life have to arise before we stop calling it evolution?" Right. So it's very abrupt geologically speaking.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of these people were confessed to be Catholics or Christian or whatever. One of them was spiritual, and thinking that this is how God set this whole thing up. It's obvious. God uses evolution, kind of walks away or uses it to do his work, like they said. And what's your thoughts on theistic evolution?
Well, I have quite a lot of thoughts. I co-edited a large 1,000-page volume critiquing theistic evolution. Might be helpful first to know a couple of reasons why I'm skeptical of Darwinian evolution. We've talked about the problem of the fossil record not conforming to the Darwinian expectation of a continuous branching tree picture. But the third meaning of evolution has to do with the creative power of the mutation natural selection mechanism, the affirmation that that mechanism has the creative power to generate fundamentally new forms of life. And I think I mentioned to you before that I attended a conference in 2016 convened by a number of leading biologists, including leading evolutionary biologists, who are completely disaffected with neo-Darwinism and think we need a new theory of biological evolution, because they recognize, and the reason for that is that they recognize that the mutation natural selection mechanism has very limited creative power. It does a nice job of explaining small-scale variations in, for example, the shape of beaks among Galapagos finches, or in the coloration of peppered moths going from dark to light and dark again, or back and forth in response to varying degrees of pollution in the industrial Midlands of England. Classic examples of small-scale microevolution.
Right. Still finches and still moths.
Yeah, but the mechanism does not do a good job of explaining where birds and insects and animals and flowering plants, et cetera, came from in the first place. So at this conference in 2016, the first talk was kicked off by a very distinguished Austrian evolutionary biologist named Gerd Müller, who enumerated in his talk the 5 major, as he put it, explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And the first one was the lack of creative power of the mutation selection mechanism with respect to major morphological change, major change in form. Now, it's important to understand why the scientists have become skeptical of that. We talked last time about the importance of genetic information and how you have to explain the origin of information to explain the origin of the first life. But it turns out that you have to explain the origin of genetic information to explain the origin of new forms of life as well. And that turns out, again, to be every bit as great a problem for biological evolution as it is for chemical evolution. And here's why. If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it?
New code.
New code, right? Software. Well, the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life, you need to have new types of cells that can make new organs and new tissues and get arranged to be new body plans. But to build new to have new cell types, new types of cells, you've got to have new proteins to service those cells. So if you have an animal with a gut, and before that there were no animals with guts, you're going to have digestive enzymes. Where are those going to come from? We got to have the code to build those proteins. Enzymes are proteins. So if you want to build a new form of life, you've got to have new information. It takes new information to build new form. So, okay, also, so far so good. The Darwinian explanation of where that new information comes from is the claim that random mutations, random changes in the genetic text, in the genetic letters A, C, G, and T, will generate a new stretch of genetic information that will have instructions for building new proteins, and those new proteins will become part of new cell types and new structures, et cetera, et cetera. Except there's a problem. The average gene is about 1,000, what are called base pairs long, 1,000 genetic letters. Those letters have to be arranged very precisely to produce a protein. As you showed in a little video last episode, the overwhelming majority of ways of arranging the A's, C's, G's, and T's are going to result in non-functional junk, gibberish, proteins that are sequences of amino acids that won't fold into proteins. So it's actually very hard to find, by random mutation, a functional protein. In fact, it's prohibitively difficult probabilistically. And here's an illustration that will help us get our minds around this. If you've got a section of computer code and you start randomly changing the zeros and ones, will you produce a new functional program or operating system? Or will, as those random changes accumulate, will you inevitably destroy the function that you have before you generate a new program or operating system?
The latter, obviously.
If you ask a programmer, they will give you exactly the same answer that you just gave me. And that's because there are so many more ways of going wrong in arranging the zeros and ones than there are of going right, of generating a functional
Yeah.
sequence of digital characters. The same exact thing is true. In other words, you're inevitably going to stumble into a functionless abyss because there are so many more combinations that result in nothing. In the case of the computer program, non-functional code then will result in a code that will do something. And the same exact thing is true in biology. There, and you showed in your little video a scientist who had done some research on this and found that for every sequence that will build a functional protein, there are 10 to the 77th power sequences that will not. That's
That's a lot.
that's a lot. That's a
Yeah.
trillion, 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 trillion.
Yeah.
It's 100 billion, trillion, 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 trillion. One in
Yeah.
100 billion, trillion, 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 trillion. I think I said enough trillions. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So
Right.
you're as you begin to mutate things, you're overwhelmingly more likely to degrade function and fall into a non-functional abyss. And if a protein isn't functional, it will not be selected and passed on to the next generation. And the code that produced it will not be selected and passed on to the next generation. So it can't participate in any more evolution. So
Yeah, dead
this
things
is a
don't
real
evolve.
problem.
Yeah.
It's called the rarity of genes and proteins in amino acid sequence space. It's kind of like if you have a lock and you want to try to find a way to open it by spinning the dials by chance alone. It'd be like looking for one combination in a lock with 10 numbers on each dial that has 77 dials. And you're just spinning at random, trying to find one very specific 77 character combination out of, as it turns out, 10 to the 77 power combinations. You're overwhelmingly more likely to fail than succeed, even if you take into account all the time that there's been since the beginning of the beginning of our planet and the evolutionary process here 4.5 billion years ago.
Yeah, if your assumption is that it is, and they probably need more time to even get that one down.
And that's the mutation part of the mutation selection mechanism. It's simply not plausible to think that random mutations can perform a search and find what they need to find in the time available. And natural selection only acts after the fact of a successful search. So even taking the role of natural selection into account does not help us solve that search problem. Random mutation has to do it first before there'll be anything to select. And the odds are prohibitively against it, even for building one new protein structure called a fold in the entire history of our planet, let alone the numerous proteins you'd need to build a whole suite of new cell types to produce a new form of animal life. So
what did you tell me last time? You told me last time I said, so it's basically impossible. And you said, we don't say that in science. We say it's what? It's highly implausible or something.
It's more likely, it's overwhelmingly, the hypothesis that that's how it happened is overwhelmingly more likely to be false than true.
Okay.
And in science, we don't elect such hypotheses as the best explanations. We want to make an inference to the best explanation. If the Darwinian explanation is overwhelmingly and mathematically more likely to be false than true, then we should look for another explanation.
And that's what this group did at that conference you went to. They realized this chance mutation, it's not flying anymore. So they got together. What did they come up with? Did they come up with anything new?
Well, I would also mention there are a lot of other reasons that the mutation selection mechanism lacks creative power. And I explain them in my book, Darwin's Doubt, in some detail. And many of those were perhaps even more emphasized than this problem of generating genetic information at that 2016 conference. But at the end of the day, one of the conveners of the conference said that the event had been characterized by a lack of momentousness, that they had essentially done a good job of characterizing the problems with neo-Darwinism without coming up with any mechanisms that had the creative power to generate fundamentally new forms of life. They talked about some new mechanisms that are real processes in biology. They have some powers, but not sufficient to generate whole new body plans.
Okay, so then it doesn't make sense, doesn't work out, but you just enter God into the picture, and He can make everything do what it wants to through evolution. So let's go there then, unless you have something else that we need to talk about with what you're saying. But let's move to theistic evolution. Why
Right,
couldn't
right. Now
God
we can
just
get back to your original
snap his
question. Well,
finger? Yeah.
here's my first critique of that, and that is that it really is, it doesn't really make sense to say that God is using the mutation natural selection process to create if that mechanism for demonstrable reasons lacks creative power. Why then say that that's God's way of creating
Hmm.
if the mechanism is not itself creative? That's kind of contradictory.
Okay. Okay.
And so there's a scientific problem with the theistic evolutionary idea, and that is that it has, in a sense, hooked its wagon to a losing horse. The mutation selection mechanism lacks the creative power to generate whole new body plans and new organs, even new proteins, I would argue. And so it's very strange to say that that's the way that God created it. If the mechanism lacks creative power, then on the supposition that God is the creator, it's likely he didn't do it that way or use that mechanism. You say, well, maybe there's some other evolutionary mechanisms. Well, you also get into a problem with the definition of Darwinian evolution, because the idea is that since the appearance of design is an illusion, or rather, let's put it this way. In Darwinian thinking, the appearance of design is an illusion because there is a known process that has the creative power to produce that appearance without itself being guided or directed in any way. And the mechanism that Darwinists have long cited as having that kind of creative power to produce the appearance of design is the mutation selection mechanism, the very mechanism we've been talking about that lacks creative power. So in that case, then, if the mutation selection mechanism, which in Darwinian thought is a kind of intelligent designer substitute, doesn't actually have the creative power to produce the appearance of design, then maybe the appearance of design is not an illusion after all. Maybe we have evidence of real or actual design, which is what we've been arguing. And so you have you have a scientific problem in that the mutation selection mechanism lacks creative power. You also have a logical problem, because within classical Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, the idea is that this mutation selection mechanism is an undirected process. If you want to say that God is directing an undirected process, you've got kind of an oxymoron there, because not even God can direct an undirected process, because as soon as he's guiding or directing it, it's no longer undirected. So you got a kind of a logical problem there. And
Right.
the theistic evolutionists have been famously ambiguous about that question. When you ask them, when you say evolution, are you talking about a guided or an unguided process? I once asked one of the very prominent theistic evolutionists that question, and he paused poignantly for kind of a long time, and then finally
I
said,
bet.
"Well, it might be guided." And I took that as something of a political answer, because the theistic evolutionists are trying to get Christians and Jews and other religious people to accept Darwinian evolution, but they don't really want to acknowledge that the main mechanism driving the process is understood scientifically to be an unguided, undirected mechanism. Again, it has to be if it's going to provide an explanation for apparent design
Yeah.
without affirming actual design. So the theistic evolutionists don't want to say, well, we're talking about an undirected mechanism, though a few fess up. But on the other hand, if they want to say that the mechanism is guided, you either have this oxymoron where you say God is guiding an unguided process, or you say, well, God is guiding the process and it is guided, but they also want to say you can't tell, and that there's no sign of that scientifically, where you could see the evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence. And so it's in that sense, then it's not really in any way a distinct scientific theory. It's no different than Darwinian evolution. It just has this theological gloss over it, saying that God is somehow behind the scenes doing something, but we will not say what, and we can't detect it.
Great.
So it's
Okay,
kind of
yeah.
vacuous at that point.
Yeah.
And then the last problem, I think, is theological. If God isn't actively doing something or actively doing something that we can detect, that's not really consistent with a biblical view. I mean, you can argue about how long the days of Genesis are in the Bible. You can argue about whether the change was continuous or discontinuous, whether the sequence of events matches the sequence we know from paleontology and geology, which, as it happens, I think it does. I think the
Oh, you
Genesis
do
account,
the order. Okay.
the order, the sequence of events as described in the Genesis account match pretty precisely what we think happened from
Okay.
our scientific reconstructions of the past,
Hmm.
which is kind of remarkable if you think
Well,
about
I
how
would
the
think it would be right. I think it would all line up. God created science. God created everything. It's all going to line up, sure.
Well, yeah, but
But yeah,
the biblical text is, if you hold the view that Moses wrote it, it was written in 1400 BC.
Mhm.
He didn't have access to paleontology at that point, or atmospheric sciences, or cosmology. He didn't know that the universe had a
Sure,
beginning.
which
But the
makes it
Bible
that more remarkable. Yeah,
gets the
yeah,
it affirms that there was a beginning correctly. It affirms that the great sea reptiles and birds came before mammals, and then
mhm,
mammals came before man. Is all the stuff's in the right order.
right.
So that's kind of remarkable. How did
No, that's
Moses
why.
know?
Well, because it's inspired. God told him.
Well, it's an argument. I
So,
think
yeah,
it
yeah,
provides an argument for that inspiration.
sure.
Absolutely, that there was a source of information available to Moses beyond what was scientifically available in his, sort of iron or Bronze Age period of time. So,
Right.
uh,
What's the big deal?
in any case,
Go
the
ahead.
last
Sorry.
problem is theological. That we don't really, if you want to say that God is not actively doing anything in creation, I think that crosses a line theologically in the sense that if the biblical text is to have any meaning at all, it's at least affirming that God is active in the creation in some way. And most models of theistic evolution are either reluctant to say how God is active, or they simply deny it by saying that the Darwinian mechanism, is an undirected process, and God is merely kind of upholding the laws of nature and watching
Hmm.
the process unfold passively
Okay.
from the mezzanine, as it were.
So he just threw out the laws of nature to act upon everything and set it all up and walked away. Just doesn't sound like the biblical God. Question here: what's the big deal? Why do these people want to combine them so badly? Is are they
Because
embarrassed that they think?
it's the claim
Go
that
ahead.
a couple of people said in your little video, they have the impression that this is what science requires. Science equals evolution. Why do I believe
Okay.
in evolution? Because science is real. Well, we think science. That's a
I think
strange
science is
construction.
real too.
Science is a human endeavor to try to
Yes.
understand what is real about the natural world. And so we think the natural world is real. We think there's evidence from the natural world that enables us to come up with good theories about what happened in the past. Um, and we think that the scientific evidence that we have is not pointing to um, the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism. And
Right.
therefore, we don't think that it makes sense to attribute, to say that God used the Darwinian mechanism as the means by which he created. I'm
Fantastic.
talking about most proponents of the theory of intelligent design.
Right.
Some
Right.
people want to say, well, God designed the evolutionary process. That's a possibility, and there's a big discussion around that.
Yeah.
I have reasons for being skeptical about that. That would be the idea that God either front loaded everything at the beginning of the universe or maybe at the very first life. But again, we don't see that evidence of continuous changes. If everything started in one, at the beginning and then just unfolded in a very gradual
Right.
Darwinian evolutionary way, instead we see the abrupt appearance of major groups of organisms, suggesting that there was perhaps activity of a designing intelligence detectable at certain points along the timeline or up and down the sedimentary rock column.
Yeah. Gotcha. This is the way that we've been talking about it. Here's how we summed it up in a video.
We've unearthed millions of fossils around the world, so with all this evidence, so to speak, it's clear that the fossil record proves evolution, right? Well, actually, no. Didn't when Darwin was alive, and hasn't since he's been gone. In fact, Chucky D himself knew this when he wrote the following. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Okay, but surely after all the time since Darwin, digging and discovering fossil after fossil, we have a more perfect geological record that supports evolution, right? Not even close, bud. Listen to how two renowned evolutionary biologists summarize the truth. Instead of finding the slow, smooth, and progressive changes, they saw in the fossil record rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seemingly out of nowhere and then remaining unchanged for millions of years, patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation. The fossil record doesn't show gradual change, and every paleontologist has known that ever since Cuvier, or however you pronounce that. Okay, I could go on, but there's always going to be opposing views because on both sides of the debate, the same evidence is interpreted through different worldviews. You got to remember that, people. Facts don't say anything. People say things based on their interpretation of facts influenced by their worldview. But that's a whole other subject, and I don't want to get into it right now. Instead, hey, let's have a little fun and take a look at some popular secular articles and charts on the fossil record and see if we can learn to separate facts from interpretation of facts by asking a few simple questions. Question 1. Did the artiste take any artistic license with what I'm looking at here? Check this out because this happens all the time. Look, isn't that sweet? So cute and fluffy. Okay, why do you think the artist made these creatures appear more human-like by throwing in an affectionate smile and depicting them hanging out like a human family going to a picnic or something? Why did he draw them walking upright? Why make the shapes and colors of their eyes more human than ape? Is any of it based on actual fossil evidence? Of course not. But if you want the story of evolution to appear more convincing, you just might fill in missing gaps with your presuppositional imagination. Just saying. Question 2. Is the attention-grabbing headline or title supported by actual facts? For instance, take a look at this popular book called Why Evolution is True. We don't even have to go any further than the jacket on this one, because on it you got a dino evolving into a bird in 3 simple steps. There you go. But then on the inside, this is written, and I kid you not. The jacket depicts a chronological sequence of fossils showing the evolution of birds. We do not know whether the actual line of descent included, now wait for it, the first 3. Say what now? Doesn't that mean these 3 shouldn't be on the cover then? Which means all you got is a modern bird, right? No evolution, just a bird. Talk about worldview filling in gaps. On to question 3. What do the graphics on evolutionary charts indicate? I mean, they sure do look convincing. For instance, on this one from the dinosaur book, you got solid red columns and white columns showing gradual progression over time. But let's read the almost imperceptible 2-point font over here. It reads, tinted areas indicate solid fossil evidence, which means the white areas represent no solid fossil evidence, right? Okay, then take them away. Uh-oh, looks like patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation, I'd say, right from their own charts. And the same thing goes for the dotted lines on this one. Look at all of them. Just so we're clear, dotted lines indicate zero evidence. Remove them and what do you get? No transitional forms or evidence of gradual progression. A bat is a bat, a kangaroo is a kangaroo, and a horse is a horse. Of course, unless, of course, the horse is Mr. Ed. Look, people, all I'm saying here is if you got facts, put them in there. If you don't, leave them out. But don't draw downright dubious, daft, dare I declare, dunderheaded dotted lines of deliberate deception dogmatically and dastardly doodle to disguise definitive data. No. Just admit what you actually see. Overwhelming evidence of living things, according to their kinds, suddenly appearing, which, as a reminder, is exactly what the Bible teaches. Now, I don't even have time to get into TV, movies, and documentaries. All I ask is that you use the same line of questioning when you watch them. And in summary, we agree with Mr. D. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. Not then, not now, not ever. And that means the whole idea that the fossil record proves evolution has been debunked. Adios.
How'd we do?
Bob, just
Yeah.
one quick thing.
Oh, no.
I kid
Oh,
you
you
not.
found it.
I looked over, like literally on the table across from me, and this book was sitting on that
Carl had it.
table. So Carl had it. It was right here. It's a real book. It's here.
Yep.
It says the same thing in the jacket as it
Yep.
did in the video. So
In the video.
anyway, I thought that was
Yeah.
funny.
That's quite a disclaimer. I never caught that. That's very. You guys did some good research there.
Yeah, we get lots of fun comments on that and get into the stuff. But Stephen, thank you so much for your time. It was always so insightful. It's so helpful. I appreciate what you do. Even more so, I appreciate your heart behind it. and your love for Christ and your love for your brothers and sisters in Christ, and helping us out, because these things are really, really important for Christians to understand, to learn how to critically think, to not just look at headlines, but to dig deep, to ask questions, to not be afraid to explore the truth, because the truth will lead back to the gospel and to God. So thank you so much for being on the show. Candace, I think you got some things to say, some websites to talk about. Is there anything that you want to say, Steve? Where's the best place to go to find out more of your stuff, to get your books and all that stuff?
Yeah, for this question specifically about evolutionary theory and the different definitions of evolution and all of that, there's two books I'd recommend. One is called Explore Evolution, and the subtitle of that is
Not those. Sorry, we'll go back.
okay. No worries. We're getting there. But the subtitle is The Arguments for and Against Neo-Darwinism. And one of the things that Darwin did that I admire is that he presented his case in Origin of Species, as he put it, as one long argument. He was arguing a case. And as one of my Cambridge supervisors used to say, there's an argument on one side. He said, beware the sound of one hand clapping. If there's an argument on one side of an issue, there's bound to be an argument on the other. And so what we do in the book Explore Evolution is present the arguments for and against neo-Darwinism, looking at each of those three definitions of evolution. So that's a great primer, and it's kind of we designed it as a supplementary textbook for high school and college. But I think a lot of people have benefited from that to get their head around this whole issue. The other book on
And
evolution,
I just want to say, some of those books, you can go to Stephen's website, Stephen C. Meyer, and you can find a list of not only the books he's written, but other ones he's collaborated on his website. So you can go there also.
Oh, thank you, Candace. And then the other picture you showed will show the book Darwin's Doubt also goes into a great deal of discussion about the patterns in the fossil record. It's about it's about the doubt that you just mentioned from Darwin, that he had about the adequacy of his theory to explain the patterns in the fossil record, and to explain the one major event in the fossil record called the Cambrian explosion, the origin of all the first animals in the history of life. So those two books I'd recommend for people who want to do a deeper dive on the whole question of evolution and intelligent design, and how those two concepts relate to one another.
And you also said to go to the Return of God Hypothesis.com, correct? And that has to do with
thegodhypothesis.com. Yeah, that's my
It's written
latest
right.
book.
You said it wrong.
It's written
That's
right.
all right.
Sorry.
No worries. It's the return of the godhypothesis.com. It has a lot of material compiled there. Debates I've done, animations of the inner workings of the cell, op-eds that I've written, lectures, and playlists. I think we even have a playlist we have playlists of short videos that I think this was a great place to get into this whole subject, and from which you can navigate to other good websites and so forth. So that's a good place to go.
Well, Dr. Meyer, thank you again so much for just joining us for part 2. It's been so great to have you on the show. We hope you, our viewers, have really enjoyed having him on. I know so many of you have commented just thanking us for having him on. So they really appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Meyer. We appreciate it. They appreciate it. Thank you so much. I just want to highlight our next episode really quick. It's going to be with guest Greg Kokel, how to engage with culture in a winsome way. Bob, you know Greg, any closing comments you want to say about him?
The godfather of cool apologetics. He's the ultimate question asker. He wrote a great book called Tactics, followed it up by Street Smarts, which is his new book, and really excited because he's one of the most practical types of people that just helps you engage with culture in a winsome way and lead to the gospel, and what he calls to put like a stone or a pebble in somebody's shoe to keep them thinking after they've had a conversation with you. And he's just one of the sweetest guys, and one of the best guys out there doing that. And he knows he's had Stephen on the show before as well, on his own show.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we're going to end with our gospel video because that is truly what it's all about. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Adios.
Adios.
Buckle up, because this is the most important thing you'll ever hear, straight from the pages of the inerrant, infallible Word of God. The Bible teaches that God created everything, and He called His creation very good. He created man in His image. Then He made woman from the man, and man named her Eve. God gave them dominion over all creation, and He also gave them free choice. Man and woman were in perfect paradise, naked and unashamed, with only one restriction. They were commanded not to eat from a certain tree in a garden where God had placed them. God warned them that if they disobeyed Him, it would be sin, and death would follow. Now, being tempted by Satan through a serpent, Eve ate from the forbidden tree, then gave the fruit to the man, and he ate it too. Thus, mankind had sinned against God. Now, a holy God must deal justly with sin, so He did. Because man had dominion over all God created, the entire universe was cursed, and we all now live in a corrupt and fallen world full of death, suffering, pain, evil, tears, and toil. The sin nature had entered reality, and since then we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and the consequences are terrifying. Dead in our trespasses, we are all doomed to eternal destruction, away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His might, and there's nothing you or I can do to save ourselves. That's fantastic news, isn't it? No, it's not. It's the worst news ever. But here's the good news. Here's the gospel. God loves us so much that He sent His one and only Son to rescue us, Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, fully God and fully man. Born of a virgin, conceived by the Holy Spirit, Jesus lived a perfect and sinless life, which makes Him uniquely qualified to pay for our sins and rescue us from God's wrath. Not only did He step down into humanity, but He was executed on a cross in our place. He was pierced for our sins and crushed for our rebellion. Upon Him is our punishment, and by His wounds we are healed. Amazing love, amazing grace. But that's not all. Jesus, after being placed in a tomb for 3 days, resurrected, thus conquering the last enemy, death. So powerful is the work and name of Jesus that whoever believes in Him will not perish, but have eternal life. So wonderful is His mercy and grace that all who call upon His name, confess with their mouths, and believe in their hearts that He was raised from the dead, shall be saved. And the one who Jesus saves is no longer condemned, but is completely set free, and will dwell in the unimaginable new heavens and new earth with Jesus and His co-heirs forever. There will be no more pain, no more sin, no more suffering, no more death, no more evil, and no more tears or toil, for Christ Himself will make all things new. This is the full gospel, and like I said, the most important thing you'll ever hear.